You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Laura Schewel, co-founder and CEO of Streetlight Data, and Carlo Ratti, director of MIT's SENSEible City Lab, to talk about what we've learned from data during the pandemic. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We've shared a few of the episodes on our Monday show, but I want to make sure folks hop on over for a behind-the-scenes look at what makes cities tick. Every month, Anthony Flint interviews leading experts, policymakers, and thinkers on topics ranging from housing to climate change to infrastructure, exploring how these issues can all be traced back to land. Some of my favorite recent interviews feature leaders like Lisa Rice of the National Fair Housing Alliance discussing racism and housing policy, and Bill McKibben on decarbonization. So open up your podcatcher and add Land Matters from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Find it on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Join at $2 a month and you'll get a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month and you'll get one of our bus-only scarves. And all supporters will have access to bonus audio, including extras from our discussion with guests such as Carol Martins, Chris Pahalski, and Andrew Simpson of the Philadelphia Office of Technology, Infrastructure, and Sustainability, and soon Laura Schewel. Thanks so much for supporting the show. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Well, Laura Schewel and Carlo Ratti, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourselves? We'll start with Laura and then we'll go with Carlo.
Sure. I'm Laura. I'm the CEO of Streetlight Data, which is a transportation data and analytics software firm. We process data to try to describe how everyone is moving, all the different modes of travel and how those modes interact. And before I was CEO of Streetlight, I was a grad student, and I was, before that, working at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and Rocky Mountain Institute, all on vehicle electrification.
My name is Carlo. I'm passionate about cities and how technology is changing our cities today. We do that in different places at MIT, where I'm a professor with a lab called SENSEible City Lab, with our design office in New York and in Italy, looking at how to design better cities, and also with some of the startups that came out of both of the past few years.
And what got you all into cities? Like, what kind of tuned your brain to start thinking about the places where we live and being interested in that topic?
I came to it from a very transportation angle when I was having my climate, epiphany about how scary climate change was and how I probably should work on that the rest of my life. It became very clear that transportation was a big part of it, and I think one of the least studied parts of what we need to do to change the course of our climate trajectory. So it came to me through transportation, and it became clear that density and land use, all of which brings you back to cities, is the lever of change for transportation emissions. And that's how I came to it.
Let me tell you just 4 numbers about cities: 2, 50, 75, and 80. Cities are only 2% of the surface of the planet, but they're 50%, a little bit over 50% of the population. They're 75% of energy consumption, 80% of CO2 emissions. So if we can do something to make our cities a little bit more sustainable, that could be a big deal globally.
That's interesting to break it down in such simple terms. I imagine you've been sharing that information for quite a while.
Well, no, there's many dimensions to cities, but when you want to look really at the hard numbers in terms of sustainability, then it's quite simple. And again, if we can make our cities better, the whole planet will benefit significantly.
And do you all work together often? Is this a partnership that is pretty frequent?
We have been working on similar topics and running into each other's for 8 years now. So I think it's more working in parallel on the academic and more business side of the same coin.
Yeah, there's similar approaches to how we look at cities, using a lot of big data and see how big data can help better understand how cities work, especially transportation data. But I would say Laura is right. It's more about, being on parallel tracks and crossing paths now and then.
Speaking of crossing paths, in the last few weeks, we've had on Andres Sevcuk and Dr. Mindy Fullilove to talk about commercial districts and main streets. And one of the things that keeps popping up in these discussions is weak and strong ties. And I'm curious, from your all's perspective, kind of what's happening to some of these weak ties during the pandemic.
Well, first of all, I want to say Andres is not only a good friend and a colleague at MIT, but also we were working together at SENSEible City Lab at the very, very beginning. And talking about weak ties, what we've been doing over the past couple of years is actually monitor connectivity on the MIT campus, seeing who's talking to whom in an anonymous way. And what you realize, and we're still working on the results, so take them with a pinch of salt. They haven't been vetted by peer review. What you realize is that actually, if we only connect digitally, our strong ties get even stronger. The people we already know a lot, but our weak ties, the people we bump into when we are on campus, when we are in the office, or when we are just in public space, for that matter. So the weak ties are getting even weaker. So somehow that's troublesome, because weak ties bring a lot of value to our social networks. There's a lot of creativity that comes from these kind of random encounters. And it turns out that physical space is one of the best catalysts for that.
So what does that mean post-pandemic? I mean, are we going to get back to having more weak ties? Are we going to get back to the office? Are we going to be traveling more or less? Does any of the data that you all have been looking at tell you kind of what the future might be?
It doesn't tell us what the future might be, because all it tells us is that if someone had told us to predict what would happen to mobility patterns, say if 40% of people worked from home for a year, we would not have predicted what happened over the last year. Like, we would have gotten it wrong. So just the data to confirm exactly what Carlo was saying is that we see more people moving around. The vehicle miles traveled are very similar in the United States to where we were before the pandemic. They're down, but not as much as you'd think, because people are still moving around. They're just moving around more in the outer parts of the city. So a way to think about that is they're staying more in the rings, not going to the more dense parts of downtown at the same level. So that does not bode well for connectivity. But also, if we talk about a post-pandemic life, I don't know if I can predict the future, but I will say if the future stays like we are here 1 year into the pandemic, it's not great for a lot of the things we want in cities, which is densification, the loose connections you see between people, transit riderships. We really need to embrace the end of the pandemic if and when it comes, as a time to push ourselves to, I don't want to say change back, but to reemerge better than we were before in the way that we use our cities and the way that we use our cities to bring each other up across all the different parts of our communities.
Yes, and one of the consequences of this, I think, is that we will go back to physical space more and more. So we'll go back to our offices. Now, I'm not saying we'll go back to where we were before. I'm pretty sure we'll continue smart working. I don't know. It depends on the company, but it depends on what we do. But certainly 1, 2, 3 days per week, even more. But certainly we will go back to physical space. So far, we haven't found a good alternative to physical space, really, for creating that serendipitous encounters that are so important for our social networks.
And Laura, we knew that the pandemic, at the beginning, the traffic took a dive, but like you said, the VMT has kind of gone back to whatever quote unquote normal or a pre-pandemic level. But if the trips aren't happening for work trips or for some of these trips to school and things that people are staying in for, what are they happening for? Like, why are people traveling?
So to be clear, we still are down a bit on VMT in most parts of the US. We're just not down all that much. So there's several consistent characteristics. So first, the trips are happening not downtown, wherever the city is. They're happening further out in the rings. And second, the trips are happening later in the day. So before the pandemic, like, our travel trends on a weekday look like a camel. There's a hump in the morning and a hump in the afternoon. Now, in almost every city, it looks like more like an elephant or a dromedary, where it sort of builds up to midday and then just stays high through what was traditionally the afternoon and evening rush. So it's a different shape of travel, a different spatial distribution of travel. In terms of the trip purposes, there's been a lot of studies that wherever you live, whatever your mode of travel, whatever type of society you live in, people have a tolerance of being on the move a couple hours a day, whether you're walking or driving a sports car. And I think people just need to move. We certainly see a huge uptick in outdoor recreational activity. I think everyone sees that. So when we see it in the data, right, we see huge spikes in activity at trailheads and parks. But I think people are, going somewhere for the heck of it, or maybe going to pick something up like a meal or a new pair of shoes, whereas before they would have gone and spent an hour shopping or eating. Now it's vehicle miles are the same if you go pick it up. So we see this deep need to move that hasn't gone away. It's just been redirected.
It's a very interesting point. It's actually related to a famous hypothesis by the physicist called Marchetti. Marchetti really says, it doesn't matter really what you have to do, where you live, if you need to commute or not, but we'll just spend a fixed amount of time, kind of a travel budget every day. And it looks like what we're seeing today is confirming some of that. At the same time, I want to add, if you just change the pattern over the course of the day, well, the impact can be very interesting because you flatten the curve of transportation, and hence you can use better our cities and their infrastructure.
Well, that's an important point because I know that the number that stuck in my head is like 19% of trips are work trips, but we design our cities around this twice a day trip where you're coming and going. And so, the idea I think that you brought up, Carlo, in terms of rescheduling cities is a really important one, and thinking about how we can kind of change our patterns after everything kind of, I always want to say go back to normal, but I don't want it to be, I don't want that to be normal. So go back to pre-pandemic times, I guess.
Yeah, and that can be much better than pre-pandemic time. If you want, one of the tragedies of the 20th century was really people doing exactly the same thing at the same time. And then, that means, having rush hour twice a day or more, and, everything is congested and you suffer because of traffic jams. But if we are able to be more flexible with our lives, maybe we work in the morning, we connect from home, we use Zoom or Teams or digitally connect or digitally work from home and then go to the office. We don't need to get to the office exactly the same time. We get later and other people go back home earlier. So if we do that, the impact on the infrastructure could be huge. It's similar to what happened with flattening the curve of COVID. Well, the point there, if we flatten the curve, then the healthcare infrastructure will not be overwhelmed. In a very similar way, the same principle can help us to flatten the curve of the city so that we don't overwhelm their infrastructure.
Yeah, it's interesting. What's happened in the pandemic is really an infrastructure optimization. Like, we've never had a shortage of infrastructure in general. We just have a shortage if 3 million people want to get to downtown San Francisco at exactly the same time of day, right? So in a way, what we've done is an optimization, which from an engineering standpoint is good. But my concern is that it also has reduced our incentives to use transit and to live a little more densely. Like, congestion is a very strong counter incentive to driving alone. So when we talk about coming back from the pandemic better, the idea of this smart rescheduling needs to be coupled with, well, that doesn't mean we can all just relax and it's easy to drive your car everywhere, right? Like, if I had to go to the office in downtown San Francisco, if I had to go at 5 a.m, which occasionally I did, I could drive because it would take 15 minutes. We don't want that to become the norm for everything. So we have to do a little thoughtful policy implementation around this concept as well.
Yeah, I agree. The Bay Bridge, I feel like, though, is always going to be congested in some form or fashion. And I hope that, we actually had folks on talking about Link 21, which is a second tube. Hopefully something will be done about that specific corridor. But I agree with you generally. Like, I just think that we can't do that anymore. We can't all be worried about, we have to take transit and can't all drive by ourselves. This brings up another interesting thought about, yesterday there was a piece in City Lab about Amsterdam and how they had a plague in the 1700s. I don't know if you all read this piece, but 10% of the population died. But what happened was they bounced back really fast because they were allowed to be a little bit more innovative. And I think that, that's something that you all probably are thinking about, and all these innovations that are happening, and what could you see happening now because we've had a chance to rethink what's happened during the pandemic for after the pandemic.
I have 2 examples. I think we do have this opportunity. First, one of my favorite things in the pandemic was how quickly pedestrian zones and outdoor dining were set up. If you've ever been part of a city planning process to get a parking spot removed or to get outdoor seating at a restaurant, it is brutal and vindictive and can take years. And the fact that this made us realize that we could do it overnight and adapt it as we learned, that was wonderful. And I would love to see that, hey, let's try something and not let any kind of change be, a civic apocalypse. That is great. And I really hope we continue that. And the other thing, so Streetlight, what we make is a digitization technology. And we actually saw usage of our products by existing customers double in the first 4 or 5 weeks of the pandemic, because all of a sudden customers realized that if you have to work from home and run a transportation system from home, all of a sudden new and modern digital tools are the only way, right? So I think it's accelerated a lot of other smart governance technologies, because I've heard this from other GovTech software providers that all of a sudden it really helped people get over the hurdle for adopting something new, which we hope will stick.
I really like this. It's really about, being able to innovate faster. It's more about a new approach to cities. I would say it's more similar to natural evolution. Natural evolution will try mutations and see what works, what doesn't. And what we started doing with our city is trial and error. We couldn't anymore perpetuate models from the past. The condition, everything changed, and we didn't have any reference. And so we had to really start innovating at a much faster rate. And I do hope that this will stay with us longer after the pandemic.
And then there's outside, there's travel and external and streets and all those things. But then there's also inside and interior design, even design of buildings and things like that. How do we see those things being affected by this opportunity for innovation?
I would say we need to look in different ways at offices and homes. For offices, I think there's probably a good opportunity to downsize. I'm hearing a lot of companies, having started already to downsize. And then you want to design the office so that it will promote some of those serendipitous encounters we were saying before. So promote serendipity in the creation of weak ties. At the same time, some of the real estate might actually be very useful in our homes. Many of us wish we had an additional room during the pandemic, especially if you got more than one person having to connect digitally to smart work or to learn digitally. And so some of those square footage can actually move to real estate and to residential. And there, I think we almost need to redefine what are the essential minimum qualities. Now, in the 1920s, really following the past pandemic, there was a broad term called existence minimum. What are the minimum existential needs for a house? And I think we need to redesign that and rethink that now in the post-pandemic era.
What would that look like?
Well, a lot of the things we've been really wishing we had over the past few months, probably more access to green, to nature, to daylight, more flexibility, the ability to create little corner where we can actually have multiple Zoom calls happening at the same time. So maybe also finding a way to open up more our homes to friends. If we spend more time at home in our domestic environment, can we actually make it more sociable? I recently had a very interesting experience with a friend in China, and that started using the kitchen almost like in a collaborative restaurant, inviting everybody for dinner and then cooking together and using that again as a way to foster connections. So somehow many ideas, and that's really where architects, designers, planners can really start thinking about the new existence minimum following COVID.
I think the point on the connection to outdoor space is so critical. Just the value of having a little bit of a porch or a little bit of a backyard became extraordinary in the pandemic. Similarly, the value of being near a park, walkable to a park, and near like a tree-lined place with a sidewalk, it always had value. But we were reminded of the value of these sorts of simple outdoor spaces, and I hope that that gets reflected in the neighborhood planning as we go forward.
It seemed like it was valuable for nature too. I mean, we saw here in San Francisco, at least, I know that I heard the birds much more because of the quiet that was occurring. And I think though some places might have been a little bit overwhelmed by the quiet, places in New York City where people are so used to noise, maybe the quiet was a little bit disconcerting too. Since both of you have started looking kind of deep into data of cities, what surprised you the most or broken assumptions you or the general population have had about cities or even mobility?
For me, the biggest surprise was how little working from home reduced VMT. And not just working from home, but eating from home and schooling from home, everything from home. And I think it really underlined to me that when it comes to transportation behavior, we don't have a good handle on cause and effect. Like, we know that more dense cities have less driving, and that's true. But beyond that, we really don't have a deep understanding of transportation behavior and our reaction to certain interventions. And the pandemic just made it glaringly evident. So for me, it made me really excited to take on a new era of studying what policies really can work to do drastic VMT reductions that we need to meet our carbon goals. So that to me was the biggest shock. I also was unpleasantly surprised that there was no reduction in traffic fatalities. Though I think the data shows us since the reasons why that happened, but that I thought that was going to be a silver lining, and it was not.
Something that surprised me is not really during the pandemic, but last summer when many countries in Europe opened up, or even now in Israel, thanks to the vaccine, Israel has opened up, how fast people really went back to big cities, wanted to be together, want to be together. I believe in Israel today, you need several months in order to make a restaurant reservation. So somehow how strong this force that binds us together in cities is, and how fast it rebounds as soon as you remove social distancing. So I think what we'll see over the next few months will be a lot of that actually coming together in physical space.
Yes, I kept seeing news reports about how packed the pubs are in Britain because they opened them back up again. You can't imagine an English person without their beer and their beer hall. So it looks like they're having a good time. I wish I could do the same. I'm waiting for those vaccines to get back together. Carlo, what's the weirdest place you've ever put a sensor?
Oh, that's very interesting. I can mention two of them. We did a project called Trash Track. So we put a lot of sensors on trash, on waste, and follow waste across all the United States, starting in Seattle, and then looking at different type of waste. A little bit like when you put a tracer in your blood in nuclear medicine, in order to see how your body performs, doing the same at the scale of an entire city, an entire country, actually, and looking at how waste is being managed and how we could do that better. Something else, is we've been putting sensors in sewage, and that's actually in order to monitor viruses and bacteria in sewage, a project called Underworlds, in order to really understand, somehow call it the collective microbiome for a neighborhood. And out of this research project, actually a startup called Biobot was started, which has been very, very successful during COVID in order to analyze sewage water and detect COVID and understand the prevalence of COVID in different parts of the city.
Yeah, they did that. I think it was Arizona State, where they actually found students in the dormitories that had COVID and they didn't even know it. So they were able to quarantine before they could spread it to pass it along. And they'd put sensors in the sewer system to figure out that connection. So those are really interesting ways to look at the connectivity between everybody and everything, especially the waste products and, whatever happens between then and there. So it's really fascinating to think about all the places and the things that we can do if we think a little bit harder about the connectivity of it all. So, Laura, we talked about VMT a little bit. We've seen data that shows that urban cores and wealthier areas kind of benefited from the walkability, but places maybe that were outside maybe didn't benefit as much. There's a kind of an equity question about that. I'm curious, is there some optimism in the data that gives us hope that we can change some of those land use decisions in the future, that maybe when we have another pandemic, we won't have such disparities in terms of who has access to walkable areas and streets?
I do not find all that much hope in the data, because the other thing we saw in the data was the low-income areas were where the essential workers worked, and they kept on going to the hospitals and the warehouses and the restaurants for the food prep. And so what more gives me hope is some of the new political emphasis on tying infrastructure to accessibility and equity. So I hope in a few years to see it in the data. I think the other thing that gives me hope in the data is that we can definitely measure it now, whereas before you could feel it, but it was hard to measure empirically. In the past 5 or 6 years, all sorts of new data techniques have come up where we can pretty easily light up a map of the US and say, here is where we have the most disparity about access to grocery or access to jobs or access to green space and walkability. So I guess the availability of the data gives me some hope, but more, I'm hopeful about the rising political will to implement what it is that we see.
Have you all taken a deep look at the American Jobs Plan that the Biden administration has pushed out? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you can only take so deep a look because it's still not, a full bill. But there's several things I really like about it. The first is the emphasis on saying infrastructure can cause disequity and can certainly cause climate and criteria air emissions. Thus, infrastructure planning should take those three things into account, not just the traditional metric for transportation infrastructure planning, which is level of service. So that fundamental change, if we can make our infrastructure goals and, more importantly, our infrastructure funding explicitly aligned with equity, climate, then I'm very excited about that. I'm also very excited about the broader definition of infrastructure. I think that is critical. When you have money to spend and it's supposed to help, say, equity, but all you can spend it on is rebar and concrete, you're actually limited in what you can actually achieve. You need holistic looks at infrastructure. So I'm very excited about all that. And I'm excited about the money going to vehicle electrification. I do wish that the plans for reducing total miles driven in personal cars were as robust as the vehicle electrification plans. It seems like there's just a lot more knowledge and a lot more granularity in the EV part than there is in some of the other parts. I think that reflects the status of the industry, but I hope to see that part deepened as we move forward into rulemaking.
I agree with all of this. And my impression in the discussion, not really in the plan, which is still fluid and being finalized, but in discussion, people still think, yes, it's not only concrete, but it's about physical infrastructure. And what we were saying before is actually how sometimes just changing the use of infrastructure, using digital platforms in order to use data to better understand the condition of the city. Well, sometimes, that is even better. It gives you a better bang for the buck. Every investment you do there can actually be better than investment in physical infrastructure. So what I would expect as the plan is finalized is really to focus on that as well, on how we can improve our cities, not only with the physical side of things, but also with silicon, with the digital side.
That's a really good point. I mean, in transportation, I think a lot of people are expecting big changes with technology specifically in curb management and parking space management and access management to city centers, congestion pricing, those types of things. But most of those are so focused on congestion and motor vehicles that I think sometimes we forget the people aspect of moving in cities and places. I'm curious if you all have any thoughts about shifting that discussion, because a lot of the discussion, even the EV discussion, is all about cars and vehicles rather than kind of the purpose of electrification is so that you can have vehicles that are not polluting, but then you can move more people around, hopefully. Anyways, is there, a way to talk through the pure vehicle discussion to a discussion about humans?
So I think there is a way, but also keep in mind that this is the American Jobs Act. And classically, it is much simpler to explain the connection of auto manufacturing and concrete infrastructure and their connection to jobs. And I understand, I get it. Of course, it's easier to explain that. But I also think the jobs potential for the silicon part, the software and the infrastructure and the decision support is also immense. And that creating bike lanes also makes a lot of jobs, and parks also creates a lot of jobs. So I think it's beholden on us. I mean, Biden has been very clear that the terms he wants to talk about this in are jobs. And I think it is beholden on us, if we want to get it passed, to frame it in that way as well. But I love the part Carlo makes that one of the challenges we've had people trying to make government smarter is money is so entailed. There could be $1 billion available to expand a highway, but the agency is literally not allowed to spend 50 or 75 grand to do analytics to figure out if they should expand the highway at all. So allowing more flexibility and allowing infrastructure decision support, as well as the physicality of the infrastructure itself to be spent on, that is just so critical. And it's wonky and nerdy, but it really holds up a lot of important change.
The other interesting thing is here, that when you think about infrastructure, people often think about best practices. So best practices are great in a space that doesn't change that much, that's a good way to go. But basically, best practices lock the future into the past. You're looking at the past, you're looking at what worked well, and then you use that in order to design for the future. And I believe that here, going back to your point about mobility and looking more at people, I think we got many new technologies. Even, think about micromobility, which is great because it's made micromobility like e-bikes, scooters, dockless scooters, and so on, is great because it actually makes mass transit much more competitive, because you can jump off the subway and then jump on a scooter, do the last mile, and so on. Or other innovations that are happening now in the space of delivery and logistics, how we can have smaller vehicles for that as well. Otherwise, our cities are going just to be congested because of all the delivery trucks, moving around. So perhaps we should use what we were saying before, this trial and error approach, testing, something more similar to what happens with venture capital. You try something small scale, you see if it works, and if it works, you grow it to the next level and then to the next level. It's very different than how we've done infrastructure into the past, but I think that is very, very needed today, when actually the infrastructure of tomorrow might be very different than the infrastructure of yesterday.
Like autonomous boats?
And autonomous flying cars.
Yeah, we're working on that in the city of Amsterdam on autonomous boats. That was a response to the city wanting to do a lot of, being a leader in autonomy, but Amsterdam is a city with a lot of canals. And so we came up with this idea of rowboats. So rowboats, robotic boats, shuttling people around. And there's some of them. So next time you're in town, let me know and I'll take you for an autonomous tour of the canals.
I'd love that. So reading through the notes, I keep thinking about DNA and movement and how we can look back in history at migration patterns. We're looking at migration patterns and data, obviously, with what Laura's doing and what, Carlo, obviously you're doing as well. But, one of the things that's really fascinated me in the last year or so is there's a National Geographic piece, but also I think it was a Nova piece about the Yamnaya, a major group of Eurasian people who, after a big European plague that not a lot of people talked about 5,000 years ago, kind of migrated into Europe, and a lot of the DNA shows that their DNA shows up in European DNA, which is really fascinating from a migration standpoint. I'm curious if there's a point where we'll be able to track DNA like digital data, and what that might mean for civilization going forward. This is kind of a big, global, not so granular question, but I thought you two were probably the best people to talk about that.
Happy to try to extrapolate on this. First of all, DNA says a lot about us, and we are still trying to decipher all of it, but certainly that's going to be monitoring that. And, I personally just had a full, complete genomic scan of myself. And certainly this type of information is going to be more and more interesting for health, for personalized health, moving forward. Just, the very, very beginning to go from that piece of code. This piece of code is how we are built. There's so many things we still don't know. And when we'll find out, we'll be able to really change the very meaning of life. But more generally, at the social level, as you're saying, I think DNA can tell us many things. We actually work with some National Geographic data in the United States in order to try to understand in a different way ethnic groups in cities and try to understand also many dimensions of cities that would not be understandable without this type of data. So somehow, it also has a lot of potential in order to better understand who we are as society, who we are in cities.
I think that migration is not an unusual event. Migration is just a fundamental fact of human civilization. And pandemics may accelerate it or push it in one direction or another, as may weather events and rulers and wars, but we will always move. And right now we're in a moment where the major migratory pull is towards cities. That's why cities have become so critical. But just as you said, there's been other major migratory patterns in the course of human history. And DNA it is certainly technically feasible to track and look at DNA as like a huge indicator of the long-term movement of peoples. In the terms of the short-term movement of peoples, it comes with a whole lot of ethical and privacy questions.
Absolutely.
So, while I think it is feasible, we look at mobile phones and connected cars to indicate movement, and we also do track migration, which we would just call moving in the short term. So I think while it is certainly technically feasible, there might be less privacy complex ways to do it in the short term. But I think the most important thing is that people are like, oh, all of a sudden, COVID is causing people to move. That is absolutely true, but also people move anyway, and people move all the time. And we should consider it the norm, not some like crazy change we have to try to predict or plan for.
Yeah. Well, Laura and Carlo, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old daily cities news list by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.